Welcome back to another episode of Whatever This Is with Carl and Aaron. This episode is a good friend of ours. I've known Isaac for almost a decade, I think. Anyway, he's an artist in the local community of Anchorage, Alaska. Boy plays quite a mean saxophone. What else is there that's good about him, Carl?
Well, he's tall and he's got that like Viking handsome about him. Like he can grow a beard and you notice when he walks in the room, but he also cleans up real nice. I mean, he's got that skill set.
He sounds like an all-around babe of a dude. Please welcome our next guest, Issac Kumpala. Awesome. How's it going, bud?
Not bad. Fred Mars's experience still.
Oh yeah, you are at Freddy's.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much looking forward to stories of just remembering my retail days.
How much crazier has it been since all this pandemic shit started?
Like that first week, particularly when Dunleavy was like, hey, all the restaurants are closed for a month, was like Christmas's evil twin brother. It was not good.
Yeah,
it was real dookie. It's kind of tapered off now. Sundays are pretty quiet. I think they kind of got the Sunday rush got split between like Saturday and Monday. Well, yeah. It's nice not to have like a massive like 5-6 o'clock rush.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So talk to me about this puppy, Isaac. Tell me everything.
Oh, this little boy. He's pretty great. His name is Riley. He doesn't like his puppy food. He doesn't eat it. He'll eat some of like our grown dog Luca's food. But you have to put like salmon juice on it. And so apparently, though, if you put salmon juice on it, sometimes he'll just lick it off and not eat the food. But he will eat just straight salmon because, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
But not only this, apparently he can't stand having food or stuff. He doesn't like having a dirty face. Like, apparently he like paws his face till it's clean after he's done eating.
That's adorable. This is him, right?
Yep. That's that little goober.
Aw, that's a good boy.
Yeah, I think that's the stillest he's ever been.
Yeah.
He's a fighter.
Oh, bud.
We would just like to know the what's going on in this photo here, bud?
Yeah. Always a fan of that long hair, and really it's kind of like a sloped bowl cut. Like what if you just took like a mop and it kind of melted a little bit on your head? and that way I don't have to make eye contact with anyone.
Aaron, you want to go ahead and show the next charming picture?
Yeah. Next up.
Oh, that is junior prom.
Nice.
Hey, Carl, you get points, bud. That's a solid guess.
Called that.
Oh yeah, he guessed for it. Oh yeah, nice.
It had that vibe. Yeah, it had that like I'm gonna do this. This is my first big prom, and I'm gonna fucking do it right.
That's right. And you like how the color of my cheeks matches my bow tie too?
We can move on.
Oh, yeah, that's
this one I know what's up.
Summer Academy.
Yeah.
And then if Isaac, you could just give us some context as to what's happening in this photo.
I was chasing. I have a rose in my mouth because I'm a romantic. And I was crawling around on the skateboard chasing girls like I always do. You know how it is.
Isaac is probably like the best candidate I can think of to like, we'll catch you up. So before we started like the interview portion of all of this, which was I think 5 hours ago, Aaron and I were talking about like comedy and when it's good or bad or offensive or like freedom of speech, those kind of arguments. And generally what we came around to is the idea of my view is like everyone has the right to say whatever they want to say. That's totally fair. And then everyone else has the right to say whatever they have to say about it. What I dislike is anytime a performer says something, and I use the quotes offensive, and then the backlash happens. They say, well, you didn't get the joke, or you're too sensitive, or, you know, you don't know what funny is. And as much as I approve of people being able to speak their mind and say their thing, I disagree with a performer who blames the audience for something not going well. And so that's kind of my hot take on it, where I say, look, everyone can accept responsibility. You don't have to watch the offensive thing. The performer doesn't have to censor themselves, but you can't blame the audience. Like that's kind of where my line in the sand is.
Yeah, that's kind of like the weird painting and the painter being like, well, you just don't get it.
Sure.
And it's like, well, okay, but then maybe it's just for you a little bit, or for very specific people. Like, a bit arrogant to just shift the blame like that. And I don't even know that there has to be blame per se. Like, it's just like, yep, you said something and some people didn't like it, and that's how they feel. But you said already how you feel already, and that's that. In a perfect world, anyway.
And I actively struggle with this, so this is a good conversation to have, because I'm still trying to form my views on it, because a lot of my views seemingly are in conflict. Like, let people say whatever they want, but I'll beat you up if you say this thing, are two thoughts I have at the same time.
Yeah. I think that a lot of the stuff that's all cancel culture and things is like, this person is like a Nazi or very far right or conservative or something that they end up disagreeing with. And I think it will have the wrong effect when you take ideas that you think are bad or short-minded, and you take on a certain amount of risk by saying, I'm not even going to entertain those ideas, because what it does is, if you don't engage with a bad idea, you can't show that's a bad idea. So what happens with like all this, like, we'll take it because it's a pretty easy example to use right now in America, all this alt-right stuff, although now it's starting to become dangerously close to the mainstream. Like, they're like, we don't want these kind of people talking at universities or stuff. But if you're so secure in your ideas, and I'm not criticizing people that don't want to engage with this necessarily, but if you're secure enough in your ideas and you feel that, you know, if you don't engage with a bad idea, you can't prove it's a bad idea. What happens is that people that are interested in what those people are going to say, for bad reasons or good reasons, are going to go to them on their own time or out of their own way. And if it's a one-on-one conversation between an audience member and someone who has an idea that you disagree with, then they get to say whatever they want. Like, because you have, like, it's kind of like the Facebook echo chamber, right?
Oh,
you hear what you want to hear, and there's never someone to say, well, you should consider this.
Right.
And I think where people see it as either one, taking the high ground by not engaging with stupid ideas, or two, think that the content is too personal to engage with, or to risk the possibility of, if someone hears it like at a campus or a meeting or something, that it's going to spread, people are going to find a different way. But if you can't show something's a bad idea and you just badmouth it, you start to kind of look, it gives people that are interested or already previous to those ideas, the idea that maybe that other person is right, because you're not engaging with them, you're refusing to engage with them, And you're acting in a higher than mighty attitude, possibly. Not all cases. Sometimes it's just, you know what, you maybe have a very personal experience with it. You can't do it. But I think there are people out there that have to be willing to do it, because if you don't pull the weeds out of the garden, then the weeds will grow.
Yeah, well, and if they don't have any other viewpoint narrative to read and interact with, you know, if the only thing they're getting is from that one side, then obviously that's what's going to flourish in their mind. You know, if your environment that you're surrounded by is absolutely going to influence your viewpoints.
But the distinction I make is that, again, I don't want to censor people. I don't want to full on stop people from having their views and opinions and to espouse them. But when their views and opinions are that like a segment of the population shouldn't exist or aren't valid, I don't want those people talking in colleges or in you know, I don't want them to have a platform at all. Anyone advocating for the harm or death of generally a minority segment of the population, then I have no patience for them at all. I don't need to hear out their views. I don't need to take their side of the issue and go, oh, I see where you're coming from, but my objection is this. Like, that's not worthy of debate to me. Just so we're super clear on this, we're all agreed, eugenics is a bad idea, full stop, and people advocating for eugenics probably, in my humble opinion, shouldn't speak at the universities. Like, ultimately, that's my view. So
I think, well, yes, eugenics, bad.
Sure.
You think about something like anti-Semitism and nationalism and all that stuff, and you kind of do the children's argument or the Socratic argument, where I think if you ask just why long enough, it just comes down to like, why? Because I enjoy power. Or you finally, you pick up enough rocks off the ground, you dig deep enough, finally kind of scrape away to the core of what it is. And I think that I'd like to believe that if that was done more, that people would be exposed, the bad people would be exposed for who they are, and that would cause people to not flock to them.
What's exhausting is the long historical view of anti-Semitism has been a thing for a while, for every generation to have to go through its own process of what you're describing and being like, well, these people are anti-Semitic, and we have to go, well, that's a bad thing. Well, why? But we've already had this discussion. We've had this discussion several times throughout history, and it ends up the same. We all agree, well, it's bad. It's morally wrong to hate a group of people because of who they are. And to be clear, I don't think I'm like super brave for espousing views and being like, I'm willing to go out there with a controversial statement. Aaron, you were on the pro-eugenics camp. Do you have any thoughts about it?
I'd like to say that I think our time has been complicated by this weird surge in anti-intellectualism. I think it's really easy for other people right now to judge other people for their insufficiencies without really coming to a reckoning with their own. And it's something that sucks, because when I was in high school, when I was a younger man 9 years ago, I was a jackass. I don't think that my acerbicness ever came from a place of wanting to be evil or anything, but was just that shocking someone or something like that, getting a reaction out of someone was something that was real. That was like, it's different from a surface level, like conversation, like, how's the weather, yada, yada, yada. But it's not necessarily the good way to do it. It's like acting out. Like, instead of having a deep connection through like a real conversation, you're saying shocking things and being controversial and stuff, just so that something real or truthful kind of happens. And so I worked a lot to be better than that. And now I'm at the very least, I still have that capacity, make no mistake, but I try to be more conscientious with like, who is this appropriate for? Who is this not appropriate for? There are times for each and every little thing. So yeah, but looping back to like what I was saying about this anti-intellectualism, I want to say that it's just something that is this weird sudden left turn in the last generation or so, or I guess kind of really since 2000. Like it's not that old. But then you think back on Leonardo da Vinci and the bonfire of the vanities when they're burning books in Italy and like the Renaissance or something. And it seems, I don't know, maybe there's a cycle between pursuit of objective reality through science and wavering that back and forth between like the Age of Enlightenment and stuff and the Industrial Revolution. It kind of wavers back and forth. And I have to wonder if we are in or are only just entering the latest manifestation of that.
So here's what I think is the good news, is I think you're absolutely right. I think we're absolutely in a new type of revolution brought on by a digital internet age, which comes with it all of the pros and cons that do, where now everyone has a voice, but unfortunately, everybody has a voice.
Everyone has a voice.
But the good news is, as we look back on the Renaissance and like Leonardo da Vinci and all the Ninja Turtles, like we tend to just remember the good stuff. We romanticize that period as like we came out of the Dark Ages, and now there's art and science, and those disciplines are merging together and creating all new advances. And we get really excited about that, and we love it. And it's a remarkable period of our human history. I think 400 years from now, we'll look back to, can you believe before 2000, like the internet wasn't a thing. Like we weren't connected in this way. And then they were, and suddenly people could collaborate and commerce was lightning fast. We'll talk about all the good things that came with it. And as a subnote of history, also Nazis became super empowered again, but good news, we shut that down. What I want to do is skip to the end. Like I want to skip past all the
growing pains.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
you're a racist with a platform, and that's a lot of fun. But if we could skip ahead to the good part where we shut that down and not have to go through all of the strife and the work and the, historically wars that have had to happen to make that change happen, I'd love to skip all of that.
Right.
And the dream is that we will, and I'm still optimistic that we will. But it means kind of what you were saying before. It means people have to engage, people have to push back, people have to question the ludicrous views that have reared its head again. But I just don't want to. It's exhausting. I don't want to do it.
Work.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. We've done this.
You know what? I think it's odd that there is that the idea of being a centrist is like dirty or shitty or wrong or cowardly. Like it's weird. Like, and I get to some level that there are people and there are aspects where you're like, if you're not on a side, if you're not with me, you're against me. Or change has to be extreme for anything to happen in the society. And maybe it does, but I think you can be extreme and extremely for. I think people see that as being non-committed to an idea when what it can be is taking the best ideas from both sides and combining them. And I've said that to people, and they just retort with like, you're not committing, or that won't work, or something. And it's like, why wouldn't you want? If I said the phrase, here's my philosophy, let's take the best of all ideas, all the best ideas, and go with those. You would imagine that seems like it should be pretty good. It should be pretty widely agreeable. Now, of course, that breaks down into like, well, what are the best ideas? What do you think are the best ideas? And personal, priorities and stuff like that. And I assume that's probably why things shake out the way they do right now. But yeah, I don't know. It's complex.
It sounds to me like you're talking about is like moderation is the key. If you're too far in either extreme, in a center is where you're going to be both fulfilled and happy in that regard. To cycle back to my only objection with the center, because I'm generally left. I think that's not going to surprise anybody to hear.
What?
I'm
Aaron's
sorry.
Surprised. Aaron's surprised. He didn't know. You need to ease him into this.
My main objection with the center as I see it, and I recognize this is not the entirety of the center, but this is what I see a lot of, and it makes me tired, is, as Isaac said before, it does feel like pick a side. Or if you haven't picked a side, don't sit on the fence and lob insults to both sides like you're above it all. If you're not going to get involved in the fight, fine, don't. But don't have that air of superiority and smugness of like, oh, look at the rabble down there fighting amongst themselves while I have the intellectual high ground. What I don't see a lot of, and maybe it's just drowned out and I don't know where to find it, but I don't see a lot of engagement and that spirit of compromise and negotiation coming from the center. What I see is a lot of pot shots from the cheap seats. And so that's when...
I think we can make the argument that that's true of our main parties as well.
Sure. But if all you're doing is insulting everyone else's views and not putting yours forward, then, then that to me is less helpful than two idiots yelling at each other about their views. The people on the sides are putting their stuff out in the field, right or wrong, and they're advocating for what their beliefs are. Whether I personally agree with them or disagree with them or not, they're putting it out there.
Shout out Jeff Bezos.
Our episode today is sponsored by anyone but Amazon.
That just means we need to have another world war.
Let's not let Nazis talk at colleges. You shouldn't marry a robot. You should never marry a robot. Look, we disagree, but I don't want you to die.
That's a good like hashtag, right? Newer negligence. And I meant that more of a Chinese wall reference than actually Trump's wall.
Society we live in now is so anti-suicide, and
you're not really free unless you can tell the person or the idea that you're negotiating with to go to hell.
It's no guns, all the guns, and some people saying some guns for some people.
There's a difference between somebody getting shot and 27 people getting shot, and it's 26 people. Please, I'll do multiplication if we get picked up by a network. Does creating self-reliance also equal fulfillment?
If you play the Kevin Bacon game of degrees there, you're like 3 or 4 degrees in influence away from like millions of people. He says that life is tragedy, but it doesn't have to be hell. Maybe you're an alcoholic or something. We got pretty far from the original infographic idea there.
Since again, I like to take very large ideas and boil them down into the boiled cabbage.
Sorry, make your point. I'll stop being a dick.
You won't.
I won't count on that. People aren't afraid to fuck things up a little bit for a bit. It's like a pendulum swinging.
Just a ship and an anchor.
No one should be slaves. That's a pretty big change. You move a penny a little bit under a microscope, it looks like it moves massive. I could have my tongue cut out, by kidnappers.
That's fair to say. We do need to go ahead and bring this to conclusion because I, honest to God, only want to do like a 15-minute episode. So look for a lot of our very good points to be cut.
This is a great conversation that no one will see.
Yeah, I'm surprised we couldn't solve the world's woes in 15 minutes. That shocks me.
Yeah.
All right, Isaac, we're asking our guests the last question before we sign off, and that is, what is the best, or at least a really good piece of advice that you've gotten?
You have to be the source of your own happiness. You have to continually pursue meaningful things to find that state of contentedness.
Thanks for joining us on whatever this is.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what it becomes, because we sure talked more than 15 minutes.
We're hitting hour number 4.
Bummer. Oh, I don't want to be the guy who has to edit this together. Awesome. Well, thanks, man. We'll catch you later.
Thank you. It was a blast talking to you guys.
Yeah, man. I'll talk to you in a bit.
Hell yeah. All right, see you later.
Bye.
Later, bro.
Whoa. Now pretend that cuts to black.
This episode is with a dear friend of ours, who is, well, what a guy. I'm gonna go ahead and retake this. Yeah.
We've known this next guy for almost a decade. He's an artist here in Anchorage, Alaska, who performs on stage at the Renaissance Fair, plays a mean saxophone. Welcome, Isaac Kumpala.
What a guy.
What do you think? Is that the intro? Did we nail it there?
Yeah, I think that take is probably our winner.
Always leave him wanting less. All right, for what I think is the 50th time, let's introduce Isaac. Super excited to cut to our absolute babe of a dude. Yeah, I think that's as good as we can expect.
I mean, here's the thing. Take a look at it after this is done, and if none of that is actually usable, we can get on and film another one. And,
Right.
we'll make it real good.